trust no one. Those are the first 3 words that ever really shaped Dipper Pines. He finds a battered old journal buried in the woods on his very first afternoon in a strange town. He opens it, and that is the warning waiting for him on the page, written in the hand of a man he has never met. It is the sort of line that sounds like wisdom when you are 12 and frightened, and the strange, generous thing about Gravity Falls is that the whole show spends 2 summers proving it wrong. Tonight, from the Channel Pine Hat, we are going to sit with Dipper for a couple of hours and look at him the way a patient, unhurried psychologist might, watching one anxious kid across one long summer and naming gently the things going on underneath. So get comfortable, turn the lights down low, let your shoulders drop, and if you have not subscribed yet, it genuinely does help us keep making these quiet little studies. Let us begin with the thing the series' own creator would tell you first. If you could get him in a chair for an hour, because it is not a fan theory and it is not something you have to squint to see. Alex Hirsch, who made Gravity Falls and who voices Stan and Suze and Bill and half the town, once wrote a short private list for the writer's room, a set of rules meant to keep guest writers from flattening the twins into cartoon types. He has shared some of them over the years, and the 6th one is short enough to carry around in your pocket. Dipper wants to grow up too fast. That is the whole of it. Not that Dipper is smart or brave or responsible, though he is all of those things. The engine underneath the character, the thing the writers were told never to lose, is that this boy is in a hurry to stop being a boy. If you were listening to a person describe a child that way in a consulting room, you would already be leaning forward a little, because a 12-year-old in that much of a hurry to leave childhood behind is almost never just eager. Underneath the eagerness, there is usually a discomfort with where he actually is. Hirsch has described the character in interviews as someone who takes himself too seriously, who desperately craves respect from the people around him, and especially from anyone older than him, because more than anything, he does not want to be treated as a kid. Read that slowly, and you can hear the anxiety inside the ambition. The wish to be older is a wish to be safe from a particular kind of humiliation, the humiliation of being small, of being dismissed, of being the person in the room whose opinion does not count yet. Dipper's not chasing adulthood because adulthood looks fun. He is chasing it because childhood to him feels like a status he keeps getting demoted to. And here's the part a psychologist would want to underline, because it is easy to miss when the show is being funny. The wish to grow up fast is itself a young wish. It is the kind of thing you can only want when you have not yet had to be an adult. Hirsch has said, almost in these words, that Mabel knows in her core that Dipper's quest for maturity is, in itself, immature, and that there is a constant tension between Dipper straining toward adulthood and Mabel trying, without even meaning to keep him in the kid space where he should be. That is a remarkably precise piece of family psychology to bake into a Disney cartoon. The sibling who insists on being serious is not more mature than the sibling who insists on being silly. They are 2 children managing the same frightening fact, that childhood is temporary in opposite directions. One of them is racing toward the exit. The other is trying to hold the door. There is something worth saying about where all of this comes from, because it changes how the whole character reads. Dipper is not a writer's room guess about what an anxious boy might be like. He is Alex Hirsch as a boy. Hirsch has been open about this again and again. Dipper is based on his own memories of being a kid, and Mabel is based on his real twin sister, Ariel. The 2 of them were born in Piedmont, California in 1985, and the fictional twins are from Piedmont too. When Hirsch talks about the summers that became the series, he is not talking about research. From 1994 to 1998, he and Ariel spent their summers with their great-aunt in a cabin in the woods, and he has credited those summers as the seed of the entire series. Mabel's ridiculous sweaters and her rotating ridiculous crushes, those were Ariel's, more or less. So when you watch Dipper worry, you are watching a grown man draw, carefully and with real tenderness, a portrait of his own boyhood nervousness. That is a rare thing to have on the record about a cartoon, and it gives the psychology a kind of weight it would not otherwise have. This is not a character being diagnosed from the outside. This is a man remembering himself. Hirsch gave a small, revealing detail once in an interview, back around the time it first aired, about the exact flavor of his own childhood neuroticism. He has described himself, a little sheepishly, as the kind of neurotic kid who carried a small stack of disposable cameras everywhere he went. Sit with the specificity of that for a second. Not a kid who liked photography. A kid who needed 16 cameras, who could not bear the thought of a moment going undocumented, unlogged, unprepared for. That is the same impulse that becomes Dipper's journal, his note-taking, his constant cataloging of a town that keeps refusing to be cataloged. The anxious child manages the terror of an unpredictable world by trying to capture all of it, to have a record, to be ready. You will see that impulse show up in nearly every episode once you know to look for it, and we are going to keep coming back to it because it is the single clearest window into how Dipper's mind protects itself. A psychologist would also notice early that the series casts Dipper's anxiety against Mabel's ease on purpose, at the deepest level of the production. When Hirsch talked about casting the twins, he said he wanted a real chemistry and contrast between someone very spaced out and silly and somebody tightly wound and neurotic. Tightly wound and neurotic. That is the brief for the lead of a children's cartoon said out loud. Dipper's anxiety is not an accident of the writing that the fans noticed later. It is the design. It is the thing his voice, his sister, and his whole town are built to bounce against. And once you accept that this is, quite deliberately, a study of a worried boy, the two summers start to look less like a monster of the week adventure and more like a long, patient piece of watching. The kind of watching you do when you love someone and you are waiting to see whether they will be all right. So that is the frame for everything that follows. Dipper is a real portrait of a real childhood, of the specific anxiety of a bright, self-serious kid who wants desperately to be taken seriously and cannot yet see that the wanting is the least grown-up thing about him. Over the next couple of hours, we are going to walk through the mechanisms one at a time, the hypervigilance, the perfectionism, the way he turns fear into research, the crush he has to grieve, the mentor he has to see clearly, the sister he has to choose, and the parents the show keeps almost but never quite letting us see. And through all of it, we are going to try to hold the same posture Hirsch held when he drew him, which is not the posture of a diagnostician looking down, but the posture of someone remembering a frightened kid with a lot of affection and wanting more than anything for him to slow down. Come back to those three words because they are the load-bearing wall of Dipper's whole psychology. And the series does something quietly radical with them. Trust no one. When Dipper finds the journal in the very first episode, the warning reads like a gift, like the secret operating manual for a dangerous place, and any anxious kid would clutch it exactly the way he does. A world that keeps surprising you is a world you cannot control. And along comes a book promising that if you are suspicious enough, careful enough, if you assume everyone is a threat until proven otherwise, you might just survive it. For a boy whose baseline is already tightly wound, that is not advice, that is permission. Permission to do the thing his nervous system already wants to do, which is to treat every stranger as a puzzle that might be a trap. A psychologist has a word for this posture, and the word is hypervigilance. It is the state of a threat detection system that has been left switched on. It scans constantly, it reads danger into ambiguity, it cannot quite let a moment be safe because letting a moment be safe is exactly when the bad thing happens. Hypervigilance is not stupidity, and it is not cowardice. Usually it is the intelligent response of a mind that has learned somewhere that the world requires watching. The tragedy of it, the thing that makes it worth treating rather than admiring, is that it works just well enough to justify itself while slowly walling you off from every person who might actually help you. Trust no one, and you are never betrayed. You are also never held. Now watch what the show does, almost immediately, before you have even had time to take the warning seriously. In that same first episode, Dipper is nearly undone by the gnomes, and the thing that saves him is not his lone wolf logic, not his suspicion, not the journal. What saves him is trusting Mabel. It is Mabel's instinct, Mabel's read on the situation, Mabel's willingness to do something that Dipper's careful, hyper-analytical brain would never have greenlit. That gets them out. The very first lesson of the entire series, delivered inside the same 22 minutes that hands him the trust no one creed, is that the creed is wrong. Connection is the thing that works. The journal's headline advice fails on its very first page. I find that astonishing as a piece of writing for children, because the easy version of this story hands a scared kid a rulebook and lets the rulebook be right. Gravity Falls hands him the rulebook and then spends 40 episodes taking it gently apart. And it does not stop with Mabel. The deepest cut comes much later when Dipper finally meets the man who wrote those words. The author of the journal turns out to be his great-uncle Ford, a brilliant, bookish, mocked for his intelligence outcast. And this is the thing a careful watcher would flag straight away. Ford is not a wise old sage handing down hard-won truth. Ford is a cautionary tale. He wrote Trust No One because trust in his life had catastrophically failed him. And the story is quite clear, through Ford's own regret, that the philosophy did not protect him. It isolated him. It cost him his brother, his work, and 30 years of his life on the other side of a portal. The man who invented Dipper's creed is living proof of where the creed ends, and part of what he comes to give Dipper, in among all the monster hunting, is a warning. Do not become me. Do not let the fear of being fooled make you unreachable. That mirror is not an accident of the plot. Dipper and Ford are built deliberately as reflections of each other. Both are the bookish kid nobody else quite listens to. Both turn to notebooks and diagrams and classification when the human world gets too complicated. The series has Ford bond with Dipper almost instantly precisely because they are so alike, and Dipper gravitates toward Ford because, for the first time, here is an adult who does not roll his eyes at the nerdy stuff, who actually wants to hear about the ciphers and the monsters and the theories. It is intoxicating for a lonely, over-serious boy to meet the grown-up version of himself, and it is dangerous for exactly the same reason, because the grown-up version of himself is a man whose great flaw is the very flaw Dipper is busy feeding. When you idealize someone, a psychologist would say, you are often idealizing a possible version of your own future, and you rarely notice at first whether that future is a warning or a promise. We will come back to Ford in his own right later because the pull he exerts on Dipper is one of the richest threads in the whole series. For now, the point is narrower and I think more important. The mentor who could most flatter Dipper's fears is also the clearest evidence those fears will ruin him if he lets them. You can see the hypervigilance expressed in the smallest, most ordinary ways, which is usually where these things live. Dipper's instinct in any new situation is to reach for the journal, to look the thing up, to find the entry that will tell him what he is dealing with. The town is genuinely dangerous, so this looks, on the surface, like competence. And often it is. When he catalogs a creature like the hide behind, he is doing real work. And there is a nice grace note buried in that particular monster, because the hide behind is not something the writers invented. It is a real piece of Pacific Northwest folklore, a logging camp tall tale about a creature that is always just out of sight, always behind you, that you can never quite turn around fast enough to see. That is almost too perfect a monster for a hypervigilant kid. The thing he is scanning for is, by its nature, the thing he can never catch scanning. A threat that exists precisely in the blind spot of your own watchfulness. You could not design a better nightmare for a boy who believes that if he is only alert enough, he will be safe. Here is where a psychologist would gently push back on Dipper's own story about himself because the journal is not, in the end, protecting him from the world. Look at what actually endangers him across the 2 summers. It is almost never a monster he failed to look up. It is his own drive, his own refusal to stop, his own conviction that he can think his way out of anything if he just works hard enough. The threats that nearly destroy Dipper come through the front door of his virtues, not the back door of some creature he did not catalog in time. Trust no one is supposed to be the shield, but the thing that keeps hurting him is not other people. It is the part of him that will not let other people in, that turns every problem into a solo campaign, that treats asking for help as a kind of failure. Hypervigilance promises safety and delivers loneliness, and the loneliness is its own kind of danger. There is a lovely, nearly invisible detail hidden throughout Dipper's world that speaks to how personal all of this is for the man who made it. Numbers keep recurring in the background of the series, and the recurring number is 618. The Mystery Shack sits at 618 Gopher Road. Stan's prison number contains it. The production code carries it. And Ford's journal, the very artifact that hands Dipper his creed, has an opening page dated the 18th of June. 618 is Alex Hirsch's birthday, the birthday he shares with his twin sister Ariel. So the book that tells Dipper to trust no one is at the level of its own printing, stamped with the date of the single most trusting relationship in the creator's life. The bond with the twin who is the whole reason the show believes in connection over caution. I doubt anyone planned that as a thesis, but it lands like one anyway. The warning is written on a page dated to the day 2 people who had never stopped trusting each other were born. So what would a psychologist actually say about the trust no one Dipper of the early episodes? Probably something like this. That the vigilance is understandable, even reasonable, given the genuinely strange and threatening place he has been dropped into. That it is doing a real job, keeping him alert, keeping him prepared, and that it is, at the same time, the exact thing standing between him and the safety he is chasing, because the safety he actually needs is not the safety of never being surprised. It is the safety of not being alone. The show knows this from its first episode and never once loses the thread. Underneath the ciphers and the gnomes and the eventual apocalypse, Dipper's whole arc is the slow, halting work of putting the shield down. If the journal is Dipper's shield, then thinking is the arm that holds it, and the way he thinks is worth its own long look, because it is the steadiest thing about him and the thing that most often fails him at exactly the wrong moment. A psychologist watching Dipper would notice very quickly that he has one main tool for dealing with fear, and the tool is analysis. He turns feeling into information. When something frightens him, his instinct is not to sit with the fear or to tell someone about it, but to study it, to break it down, to find the pattern, to write the entry. There is a name for this in the clinical world, and it is intellectualization. It means using thought to keep emotion at a safe distance, converting the raw, wordless experience of being scared or hurt or overwhelmed into a problem to be solved. It is not a lie, and it is not laziness. It is one of the more sophisticated defenses a mind can run, and it is extremely common in bright children because bright children discover early that thinking is the one arena where they can win. You can watch it happen almost anywhere in the series. A strange creature appears, and while another kid might scream and run, Dipper is already reaching for the book, already narrating the taxonomy, already treating the monster as a specimen rather than a threat. Gravity Falls even hard-codes his love of decoding into its own structure in a way that is easy to miss unless you have gone looking. The end credits of Gravity Falls carry hidden ciphers, and they are not random. Across the run, they teach a genuine, escalating cryptography course. The earliest episodes use a simple Caesar cipher, where every letter is shifted by 3. Then the show moves you on to the @bash cipher, which flips the alphabet end to end. Then to a number substitution where each letter becomes its position count, and eventually to a keyed Vigenère cipher, the hardest of the classical codes, with the key hidden somewhere in the background art of the episode itself. Decoding Gravity Falls is, quite literally, a classical cryptography lesson, delivered in secret to whoever is patient and anxious enough to sit and work at it. And that describes Dipper exactly. It does not just star a boy who decodes the world to feel safe. It invites the audience to become that boy, to sit up late turning letters into meaning, chasing the reassurance that everything is a puzzle and every puzzle has a solution. Here's the interesting thing to notice about that, and it is not a criticism. Intellectualization works. As a way of moving through a monster-infested town, treating threat as a research problem is genuinely effective. Dipper solves things. He cracks the codes. He finds the entries. He outthinks the traps. His mind is a real and reliable asset, and the series never makes the cheap move of pretending that being smart is a flaw or that thinking is somehow inauthentic compared to feeling. What it does instead is much more honest and much more useful. It lets the thinking work brilliantly on everything except the things that matter most, and it lets you watch the tool fail in real time whenever the problem in front of Dipper is not a monster but a feeling. Every emotional climax in the series is built deliberately to defeat his default. When the real crisis comes, it is never something he can look up. There is no journal entry for what to do when your sister needs you more than your ambition does. There is no cipher that decodes the sentence you should say to a girl who is too old for you. There is no research problem hiding inside the moment you realize you have been treating a person as a puzzle. Over and over, the show corners Dipper into a place where the only way through is to stop solving and start feeling. And you can see in his face how much that costs him because feeling is the one arena where his great advantage evaporates. A boy who has organized his whole sense of safety around being the smartest person in the room is, by definition, helpless the instant the task is not intelligence but vulnerability. That is the quiet engine of nearly every Big Dipper beat. And once you see it, you cannot unsee it. There is a production detail here that makes the whole thing more moving. And it goes to how the character was actually built. As far as fans have pieced together from interviews, Hirsch originally pictured Dipper as intensely self-serious and tightly wound. A boy who would only later be softened by Jason Ritter's warmth in the booth. Hirsch has talked about this. The blueprint was a boy who was, in his words, so smart. And the danger of a character like that is obvious, which is that he becomes a walking calculator, a little know-it-all with no interior. Hirsch was so alert to that danger that he wrote it directly into his private rules for the writer's room. By most accounts, one of his private rules for the writer's room amounted to a warning not to turn Dipper into a walking calculator, to remember that he is a real kid, that he has insecurities, and that pigeonholing a character into one single type strips them of their humanity. That is a striking thing for a showrunner to feel he needs to say in writing. It tells you that the intelligence was always meant to be the surface, not the substance. And the substance, the warmth, and the naivety, and the sweetness that keep Dipper from being an insufferable little brain came in large part from the actor. By most accounts, Hirsch has credited Jason Ritter's performance with adding the vulnerability that made Dipper relatable and grounded, softer and more human than the colder version on the page. Think about what that means for the psychology, the intellectualization, the armor that was in the writing, the frightened, tender kid underneath the armor that was partly a gift from the voice. Ritter, by all accounts, threw himself at the role with an almost anxious devotion that mirrored the character. As the story goes, there was no backup plan for the part, no plan B, and Ritter was reportedly in the recording booth before anyone even called him. The person voicing the boy who cannot stop preparing was himself a bit of a compulsive over-preparer, and something of that made it onto the tape. The result is a character whose surface is all cold analysis and whose sound is all soft, worried, eager to please humanity. And the gap between those two things is precisely where Dipper lives. What would a psychologist make of a child who copes this way? Probably a mix of respect and a little worry. Respect because intellectualization is a genuinely adaptive strategy and it has clearly served him. It is how he has survived a town that wants to eat him, and more than that, it is likely how he survived whatever came before. The ordinary childhood loneliness of a kid who was always a little too serious for the room, always a little out of step with children his own age. Thinking was where he was safe. Thinking was where he was good. When you are that kid, you learn to route everything through the part of you that works. And over time, the routing becomes so automatic you forget there was ever another way to be. The worry is the flip side of exactly that. A child who only knows how to think his way through pain is a child who has never learned to be comforted through it, and the two things are different. You cannot analyze your way to feeling held. At some point, the analysis has to stop, and the stopping is the hardest thing you will ever ask of a mind like his. The show understands this so well that it makes the stopping the whole point. If you had to compress Dipper's growth across 2 summers into a single sentence, you could do worse than this. He learns that some problems are not solved, they are shared. The journal never stops being useful. The cryptography stays a genuine tool. But the boy learns, painfully and slowly, that the things that matter most in his life are not entries to be decoded. They are relationships to be lived, and that the smartest thing he can do in the moment that matters most is often to put the book down and let himself feel something he cannot fully explain. For a kid who built his entire sense of self on being the one with the answers, that is not a small lesson. It is a rearrangement of the foundation. And the fact that a children's cartoon has the patience to dramatize it again and again without ever once mocking the intelligence it is asking him to set aside is one of the reasons this show has aged the way it has. There is a particular kind of fear that hums underneath almost everything Dipper does, and it is not the fear of monsters. It is the fear of being caught out, of being revealed as small, as unready, as a kid pretending. A psychologist would call the shape of this perfectionism, though that word has been worn smooth by overuse, and people tend to hear it as a compliment, as in the tidy person who color codes their calendar. The clinical version is heavier and sadder than that. It is the belief, usually formed young and usually never examined, that your worth is equal to your competence, that you're only as safe as your last success, and that any failure, however minor, is not an event but an exposure. A perfectionist in this sense does not chase excellence because excellence feels good. They chase it because the alternative feels like being seen, naked, for the fraud they secretly suspect they are. And Dipper, over and over, behaves exactly like a child who has quietly signed that contract with himself. Watch how he handles embarrassment, because embarrassment is the perfectionist's kryptonite, and the series keeps handing it to him. Early in the first season, there is an episode where Dipper, desperate to seem older and cooler than he is, performs a version of himself that is not quite real, acting his way toward maturity because the actual 12-year-old feels like a liability. This is a small thing, and the episode plays it for laughs, but it is diagnostically precise. The need to seem mature is already load-bearing for him. He cannot simply be where he is, a young kid at the edge of a group of teenagers. He has to manage the impression, perform the competence, hide the seams, and the effort of the performance is exhausting in a way it lets you feel, because you have all, at some point, done the thing Dipper is doing, stood in a room full of people slightly older or slightly cooler, and tried to arrange your face and your words into someone worth taking seriously. The clearest, strangest expression of his perfectionism comes in the episode with the time machine, and it is worth slowing down on because of how far it is willing to take the metaphor. Dipper, mortified by an embarrassing moment in front of Wendy, gets his hands on a device that can undo the past, and he uses it again and again to erase the humiliation and try for a better version. Think about what that fantasy actually is, stripped of the sci-fi. It is the perfectionist's deepest wish, made literal, the wish to go back, the wish that no mistake had to be permanent, that every social stumble could be quietly deleted and re-recorded until you got it right. Most of us carry a low-grade version of that wish, the 3 a.m. replay of the thing we said wrong, and Dipper is simply given the machine we all secretly want. And the show is merciless in the gentlest way about what it costs. His compulsive rewinding, his refusal to let a single bad moment stand, ripples outward and ends up costing Mabel her pet pig, Waddles. The lesson lands with real weight. The pursuit of a flawless past is not free. Someone always pays for your refusal to be embarrassed, and it is usually not you. There is a delicious piece of background trivia buried in that same time travel material, the kind of thing that rewards exactly the obsessive attention Dipper himself models. The time traveler who owns the machine, a hapless figure named Glendon, can be found hidden in the background of the series' very first episodes, standing in the bushes, lurking in a crowd, present before he has any business being present. Fans eventually worked out that this is not a goof but a bootstrap paradox, a little loop in time retroactively explained as a punishment for the twins meddling with the machine in the first place. I bring it up because it is such a fitting piece of design for this show. The universe of Gravity Falls is one where your carelessness with time literally reaches backward and rearranges the past, where consequences are woven into moments you did not even know were moments. For a kid whose whole anxiety is about consequences, about being caught, about the permanence of mistakes, that is the perfect world to be trapped in. Perfectionism has a cousin, and the cousin is the fear of your own body giving you away, because the body is the one thing you cannot control by being clever. Here, the series does something I find deeply tender. In the episode built around the twins competing over height, Dipper is thrown into a small crisis by the discovery that Mabel has grown taller than him. On paper, this is a joke, a sight gag about a boy standing on his toes. Underneath, it is about a very specific adolescent horror, which is that your physical development is public, uncontrollable, and completely out of step with the person you are trying to convince everyone you already are. Dipper wants to be older, his body insists on being 12. He chases a magic crystal that can change size because he wants, quite literally, to fix his body into agreement with his self-image, and of course it goes wrong because the whole show is built on the futility of trying to shortcut your way past being a kid. The height gag is comedy on the surface, and underneath, one of the truest things the series ever says about him. The parts of himself he is most ashamed of are the parts he cannot think his way out of. His mind is his kingdom. His body is a place where he is not in charge, and he hates it. The most fascinating window into Dipper's perfectionism, though, is the episode where the series splits him into pieces, and I mean that literally. There is an episode where Dipper, trying to be everywhere and do everything at a big party, ends up with a small army of copies of himself, and the copies immediately begin to fracture along the fault lines of his competing desires. One faction wants to be responsible. Another wants to impress the girl. They argue, they scheme, and eventually they turn on the original. It is a cartoon about clones, and it is also one of the cleanest dramatizations of internal conflict you will find in any children's show because the copies are not random. They are Dipper's own incompatible wants given bodies, fighting it out in the open. The perfectionist is a person at war with himself, forever trying to satisfy two masters, the version of him that should be sensible and the version that needs to be admired, and the episode simply makes that war visible. What makes this one especially telling is a choice Hirsch made behind the scenes. As the story is usually told, the network's natural instinct with a clone premise was to make one of the copies turn evil. A sneering villain double, the sassy jerk who does bad things and never learns. Hirsch pushed back on that. He did not want the clones to be villains. He wanted them to be a way for Dipper to confront his own over-planning and over-preparing the way he gets in his own way. And he explicitly rejected the studio preference for characters who are just jerks who learn nothing. That is a small production fact with a big psychological implication. The show refused to let Dipper's internal conflict become a monster to be defeated. It insisted that the copies were still him, still worth understanding, still fundamentally sympathetic even when they were being difficult. The enemy in that episode is not an evil twin. It is a good kid's tendency to try to do everything perfectly at once and tear himself apart in the attempt. And the resolution is not that he kills the bad version of himself. It is that he stops trying to be in two places, two people, two performances at the same time. Sit all of this beside the creator's own through line and it clicks into place. If Dipper's in such a hurry to be older, then perfectionism is the tax he pays for the ambition. You cannot rush toward being older, more competent, more respected, without becoming terrified of every sign that you are not there yet. The embarrassment he cannot tolerate, the mistakes he wants to erase, the body that will not cooperate, the two versions of himself that will not reconcile, these are all the same wound seen from different angles. He has decided, somewhere he cannot articulate, that being a kid is a failure state, and so every ordinary childhood stumble, every blush, every inch of height becomes evidence in a case he is prosecuting against himself. A psychologist would want, more than anything, to loosen that, to help him see that the failures he is so frightened of are not exposures at all, that being 12 and awkward and wrong sometimes is not a secret shame to be hidden, but simply the accurate and unremarkable condition of being 12. The series, patiently, is trying to teach him the same thing. It just takes him 2 summers and a lot of broken machines to begin to hear it. Somewhere in the first season, the series hands Dipper the question that every boy his age gets handed, usually without anyone asking whether he wants it. And the question is what it means to be a man. The episode built around this is one of the more thoughtful things Gravity Falls ever did. And a psychologist would find it almost startlingly on the nose in the best way. Dipper, stung by being seen as unmanly, goes looking for masculinity itself, and Gravity Falls personifies it as a tribe of enormous, bellowing, half-bull creatures called Manotaurs, who are exactly as ridiculous as they sound, and who represent a very particular and very narrow idea of what a male is supposed to be. Loud, violent, contemptuous of softness, certain. Dipper wants what they have, or thinks he does, and the episode is the story of him slowly discovering that what they have is not worth the price of admission. Start with the joke hidden in the name because it tells you the writers knew exactly what they were doing. The Manotaurs are a play on the Minotaur, the bull-headed monster of Greek myth, a creature that lives in a labyrinth and exists mostly to be dangerous. The show has taken one of the oldest images of brute masculine threat in Western storytelling and made it a gym full of insecure meatheads. That is not an accident. It is an argument made in a visual pun that the mythic ideal of manhood, the pure aggressive force, is fundamentally a bit of a joke, a labyrinth with nothing wise at the center of it. And Dipper, who is a gentle, bookish, tearful kid, is being asked to admire it, to earn its approval, to prove he can be that. The tragedy in miniature is that he wants to. A boy who feels small will reach for the biggest, loudest version of strength on offer, even when every honest instinct he has is pulling the other way. The turn comes when Dipper meets the multi-bear, and this is the emotional core of the whole thing. The multi-bear is a monster the Manotaurs want Dipper to kill as his final test of manhood. And when Dipper reaches him, he finds not a beast, but a lonely creature who has been ostracized, in part for a secret. The multi-bear loves soft, uncool pop music. He is embarrassed by it, hides it, expects to be mocked for it, and this is where Dipper does the thing that actually makes him who he is. He does not kill him, he recognizes him. Because Dipper, too, secretly loves the exact kind of music a boy is supposed to be ashamed of. He shares the shame, so he refuses to punish it. He spares the multi-bear and walks away from the Manotaurs' approval. And in doing so, he arrives at the lesson the whole episode was built to deliver, which is that there is no single correct way to be a man, and that the version being sold to him, the loud and violent and hard version, is not strength at all. It is just fear wearing armor. The music matters more than it first appears, so let me stay with it. Dipper's guilty pleasure, the thing he is supposed to be ashamed of, is a pop group the series calls Baba, which is a fairly transparent parody of ABBA, and his favorite song is a piece of glittery disco pop pastiche. Sit with how deliberately unscary that is. The thing Dipper has been taught to hide, the taste that supposedly disqualifies him from manhood, is not anything transgressive. It is mainstream cheerful, Swedish-flavored 1970s pop, some of the gentlest music ever recorded. And that is the whole point. The writers are making an argument that the policing of masculinity is fundamentally arbitrary, that the things boys are told to be ashamed of are usually not shameful at all, that the shame is the problem and not the taste. A psychologist would recognize this instantly as one of the more damaging patterns a young boy internalizes, the idea that whole categories of feeling and pleasure and gentleness are off limits, forbidden, unmanly, and that to be acceptable, you have to amputate them. Dipper is a kid who cries easily, who dislikes violence, who loves a soppy pop song, and the culture around him keeps suggesting those are defects. It insists over and over that they are not. Here is where a remarkable piece of production history comes in, because the awkward adolescence at the core of Dipper is not only in the writing, it is in the sound of him. When the series was being cast, the team was looking for a boy whose voice was on the cusp, right in the middle of the change, and Jason Ritter got the part for a reason that tells you everything about the character. Of everyone who auditioned, Ritter was the one who could produce natural, unforced voice cracks. Not perform cracks, not a comedian doing a bit. Real ones, the genuine article, the physiological glitch of a voice that is halfway between a boy's and a man's. The show could fake almost anything, the monsters, the town, the whole impossible world, but it could not fake that particular sound, and it wanted it so badly that it built its casting around finding it. So Dipper's voice, the actual instrument, carries the theme. Every time it breaks, every time it slides from a squeak up into something almost adult and back down again, you are hearing puberty itself. The exact process the entire character is anxious about, made audible. The awkwardness of becoming a man is not just something Dipper talks about. It is something you hear in his throat, in a sound the production chased down on purpose because nothing else would do. There is a poignancy to that when you set it next to the masculinity episode, because the thing the Manotaurs would mock, the cracking voice, the not yet a man-ness, is precisely the thing the series treasures most. The very quality a rigid idea of manhood would call weakness, the in-between, unfinished, still becoming quality of a boy in the middle of changing, is the quality the makers found so precious they auditioned the whole world to capture it. Dipper spends the episode trying to leap over exactly the awkwardness that makes him lovable. The story, quietly, is on the side of the awkwardness. It is worth remembering the era this was written in because it makes the gentleness braver than it looks now. This was a mainstream kids' cartoon on a major children's network in the early part of the 2010s, and the Standards and Practices Department of the time was famously watchful about anything that pushed against the narrow norms of the moment. We know from notes Hirsch himself later made public that the network fought him on all sorts of small things, and that a recurring pair of side characters, the town sheriff and his deputy, drew repeated pushback simply for the suggestion of a same-sex bond. I raise that not because it is about Dipper directly, because it is not, but because it is the weather he was written in. To put a soft, tearful, disco-loving boy at the center of a show in that climate, and to make the whole thesis of an episode be that there is no one right way to be a man, was a genuine choice with a bit of spine behind it. The gentleness was not the path of least resistance. Someone had to argue for it. What would a psychologist make of Dipper's masculinity seen across the whole run? Probably that he is doing, in fast-forward and under monster movie conditions, the ordinary and difficult work of adolescent identity formation, the job of figuring out what kind of person, and specifically what kind of male person, he is going to be. The danger for a kid like him is the same danger it is for a lot of real boys, which is that the loudest available scripts are the narrowest ones, and that a sensitive child under pressure to prove himself will often reach for the version of manhood that most betrays his actual nature. The health, the growth, is in what Dipper does with the multi-bear, which is to choose recognition over conquest, kinship over approval, and to walk away from the tribe that would only have accepted him if he became someone smaller than he already was. He is not more of a man for having spared the monster, he is simply more himself. And the show, in one of its gentlest gestures, lets that be enough. No study of Dipper would be honest without the crush, because the crush is where a lot of his anxieties come together, and because the way the series handles it is unusually careful for something aimed at children. Dipper spends most of the 2 summers quietly, hopelessly in love with Wendy, the older teenage girl who works the counter at the Mystery Shack. She is around 15, he is 12, going on 13. Nothing about that gap is going anywhere, and it knows it, and the remarkable thing is how gently it uses that knowledge. This is not a story about whether Dipper gets the girl. It is a story about a boy learning what to do with a feeling that has nowhere to go, which is one of the widest and least dramatized experiences of early adolescence. It is worth being precise about what a first crush actually is, because it is rarely about the other person in the way the crushing kid believes. A first crush is often a kind of rehearsal, a safe container for feelings that are new and enormous and slightly terrifying, and it tends to attach itself to someone a little out of reach precisely because the distance keeps it safe. Wendy is, in a sense, the perfect object for Dipper's longing exactly because she is unavailable. He can pour everything into it, all the yearning and the fantasy and the practice of what it feels like to want someone, without ever having to face the far scarier prospect of a real, mutual, reciprocated relationship with all its risk. The crush is intense and it is real, but it is also, in a way, protected. And for a boy as anxious about exposure as Dipper is, an unrequited crush is almost the only kind he could safely have. You can watch him pour it onto the page, and this is one of the loveliest details in the expanded material. If you read the physical journal that the show later put out as a real book, you find Dipper's own handwriting contradicting itself in the margins. On some pages, he mocks Mabel's endless crushes, rolls his eyes at romance, declares that crushes are a waste of time. The classic posture of a kid protecting himself by pretending he is above the whole thing. And on the very same pages, sometimes he gushes about Wendy, abandons his monster notes entirely, and lets a diary about wanting to confess to her spill out where the field research is supposed to be. That contradiction, in his own hand, is one of the truest things in all of the material. He is a boy who has decided that feelings are embarrassing and beneath him, and who is absolutely drowning in one and cannot reconcile the two. So both just sit there on the page, side by side, unresolved. Anyone who was ever a self-serious young teenager will recognize that exact split, the performance of being above it, the private helplessness underneath. Gravity Falls even hides a little joke about the doomed crush in its cipher layer, for the fans patient enough to decode the credits. Some fans point to a first-season credit cipher that, once unscrambled, seems to riff on the old video game line, as if the series were gently telling Dipper that his Wendy is in another castle. That is the writing in code a full season before the arc resolves, gently telling its hero what he does not yet want to hear. She is not for him. The prize is in another castle, and there is something kind about bearing that truth in a cipher, because it means the message is only there for the kind of obsessive, invested viewer who is, essentially, Dipper himself, decoding the world for reassurance and finding, instead, a soft piece of bad news. The turn comes in a second season episode where Dipper, believing for a terrible moment that Wendy has died, finally blurts out the confession he has been guarding for a year. She survives, of course, and then the show does the thing that makes this arc worth talking about. Wendy does not laugh at him, she does not recoil, she does not make it weird, she does not use it against him. She tells him kindly and clearly that she is too old for him, that it cannot be what he wants it to be, and that she is not going anywhere as his friend. It is, in the language of a therapist, a boundary held with warmth, and it is rare to see one modeled this well anywhere, let alone in a cartoon. She does not abandon him to protect herself, and she does not betray the truth to spare his feelings. She does both hard things at once. She tells him no, and she keeps him. And here's the part I think is radical. the part a psychologist would most want to point at. Wendy already knew. She had known about the crush for a long time before he ever confessed it, and she had been managing it with care the whole time, setting the gentle boundary long before he forced the issue. So the confession does not surprise her. It does not endanger the friendship. It simply names out loud something that was already understood and already being handled with kindness. That reframes the whole thing. The scary act of confessing, the thing Dipper had built up into a catastrophe in his head, turns out to be far less dangerous than his anxiety promised. The world does not end. He is not humiliated. He is, if anything, met with more tenderness than he expected. For an anxious kid who catastrophizes every social risk, that is a profound and gentle correction. The thing you are most afraid to say is often already known, and saying it is often survivable, and the people who actually love you do not leave when you are honest with them. What Dipper is really learning across this arc is how to grieve a no and keep the relationship, which is a skill many adults never manage. The healthy path through rejection is not to sulk, not to burn the friendship down, not to decide love is stupid and wall yourself off, and not to keep pushing until the boundary breaks. It is to feel the loss, let it be real, and then choose the person anyway in the form the relationship can actually take. Dipper does exactly that. He lets go of the fantasy and keeps the friend. The show marks the completion of this at the very end in a costume detail that carries the whole emotional weight. Dipper wears his blue cap for the entire series, and in the finale, Wendy trades him her hat, the lumberjack-style one she always wears. It is a small gesture, and it is enormous. The swap says, without a word, that he has grown past the crush and into something more durable, a real friendship between two people who are simply at different stages of their lives. He does not get the girl. He gets instead the far more useful thing, which is the experience of having loved someone, been gently refused, and stayed. There is a piece of production history that makes the whole Wendy thread even more interesting, because it turns out the crew found her surprisingly hard to write for. By some accounts, the crew circled around a solo, Wendy-centered episode more than once across the run, and never quite found a supernatural plot element that felt right for her. Think about what that means. The character who is the object of Dipper's entire romantic arc never got her own spotlight, not because the makers did not care about her, but because they cared enough not to force it. There is something fitting in that, almost accidentally. Wendy remains to the end a little out of reach, a person with an interior the series gestures at but never fully opens, which is more or less exactly how she exists for Dipper. She is real, she is kind, she is her own person with her own life, and she is never quite fully his to know. The crush is a lesson in loving someone who is a whole person in her own right, and not a prize, and the writers, by never quite managing to make her episode, left her exactly that. A person, not a trophy, which is the only healthy way for a first crush to end. To understand Dipper at all, you have to understand him as half of something, because he is a twin, and being a twin is not the same as having a sibling. It is a particular condition, psychologically, and the show treats it with more seriousness than almost anything else it does. A twin has never known a version of themselves that was not also part of a pair. The self and the other self arrive together, grow up entangled, define each other by contrast from the very beginning. And so the ordinary developmental task of adolescence, the job of separating from your family and becoming your own person, is doubled and complicated for a twin because the person you most need to separate from is also the person you are most fused with, the one who has been in the room literally since before you were born. A psychologist would call the work Dipper is doing across the summer individuation, the slow, necessary, frightening project of becoming a distinct self, and the reason it is so fraught for him is that the self he is separating from is Mabel, and he loves her more than anyone alive. The series establishes the rules of this relationship so firmly that Hirsch actually wrote them down. When he made his private list of commandments for the writer's room, the very first rule was that the kids like each other and that this never changes. Read that again because it is doing a lot of work. The default mode of sibling comedy, especially in cartoons, is bickering, rivalry, the two kids who cannot stand each other and are stuck together. Hirsch banned that from the start. Whatever conflict the twins have, and they have plenty, The floor underneath it is affection, always non-negotiable. They are not enemies who happen to be related. They are best friends who happen to be siblings. Another of his rules is just as telling, the one noting that the twins grow closer in unfamiliar situations because they need each other, and a little more prickly in familiar ones. That is an exquisitely accurate observation about how real closeness works. It is when the world gets strange and threatening that Dipper and Mabel fuse back together, and it is in the safety of the ordinary that they can afford to push apart. The writers understood that pushing apart is not the opposite of love. It is something love makes room for. The clearest study of the individuation struggle is the episode about height, and I have talked about Dipper's side of it already, his shame at his sister growing taller, his frantic attempt to fix his own body. But the episode has a second half that belongs here because it reveals the whole thing is mutual, and the mutuality is the point. When it comes out that Mabel engineered her height advantage, her confession is devastating in its ordinariness. She admits she wanted to win at something, anything, because Dipper beats her at pretty much everything else. Sit with that for a moment. Here is the sunny, confident, socially gifted twin, and underneath the sunshine she is secretly keeping score, aware that her bookish brother outshines her in the arenas the adult world tends to reward, and aching for one domain that is hers. Both twins, it turns out, are looking across at the other, and seeing someone who wins. Both are secretly afraid of being the lesser one. The same wound mirrored. Dipper fears he is not old enough or big enough or worthy of respect. Mabel fears she is not clever enough or accomplished enough to be taken seriously. They are two children with the same fear pointed in opposite directions, and the series lets them discover, gently, that neither of them is winning the contest the other imagines. There is a secret about Dipper that Hirsch let slip in an online question and answer session with fans back in the early days of the show, and it is one of the sharpest keys to his psychology. Hirsch said that Dipper is secretly jealous that Mabel is better socially than he is. That is such a specific, real human thing, and it complicates the easy reading of the twins. The obvious version of this pair is that Dipper is the capable one, and Mabel is the goofy one, the brain and the heart. But the creator's own hidden truth flips it. Dipper, for all his intelligence, looks at his sister's effortless ease with people, her ability to walk into any room and belong, her talent for connection, the very thing his hypervigilance and his self-seriousness make so hard for him, and he envies it. He can decode a Vigenère cipher, and he cannot, without agony, talk to a girl. Mabel can talk to anyone and never thinks twice. The smart kid who envies the easy socializer is one of the commonest and least discussed dynamics among siblings, and Gravity Falls put it right at the center of its twins, then mostly left it unspoken, exactly as it usually is in real families. It matters here, to be fair to Mabel, and the series is fierce about this because getting her wrong throws Dipper out of focus too. Another of Hirsch's commandments is, essentially, that Mabel is not stupid. She is a ham, she is silly, she is loud and impulsive and ruled by her heart, but she is not the dumb one, and she is not there to make Dipper look good by contrast. She is socially brilliant, emotionally perceptive, and truly kind. And in a great many of the series' crises, she is the one who is right. Remember that it is her instinct, not Dipper's logic, that saves them in that opening episode. The contrast between the twins is not brains against nothing. It is two different kinds of intelligence, the analytical and the emotional, and the show is careful again and again to show that Mabel's kind is not the lesser one. If anything, the arc of the series is Dipper, slowly learning that his sister's way of moving through the world, trusting, warm, connected, is the thing he most needs to grow toward, not away from. This is where the individuation gets tricky, and where a psychologist would be paying closest attention, because Dipper's task is not simply to separate from Mabel. If it were, it would be easy. He could just pull away, become his own cold, competent, solitary self, and call it maturity. The show has a name for where that road leads, and it is Ford, the brilliant twin who did separate, who did become his own self, and who ended up alone. No, the real task is harder and more subtle. Dipper has to become a distinct person without severing the bond, has to find out who he is apart from his sister while still choosing to stay bound to her. That is the healthy version of individuation, and it is a knife edge. Pull too little and you never become yourself. pull too hard and you lose the person who made you feel safe enough to become anyone at all. Everything that happens in the back half of the series, the mentor, the apprenticeship, the terrible choice, is essentially a stress test of whether Dipper can walk that edge. You can hear the maturity of the series' thinking in how it refuses the easy answer. It never suggests Dipper should stop being ambitious, stop being smart, stop wanting his own path. And it never suggests he should stay welded to Mabel forever, two halves of one person who never grow up. What it argues for is something more grown up than either. It argues that you can be your own person and still belong to someone, that individuation and attachment are not enemies, that the goal is not to choose between having a self and having a sister, but to have both. Dipper spends the summer learning that being close to Mabel does not make him less himself, and that being himself does not require leaving her behind. For a twin, that is the whole ballgame. And when the final crisis comes and he has to choose, out loud, in front of everyone, between an idealized future without her and an ordinary one with her, the choice is only as meaningful as it is because it spent 40 episodes teaching him and us exactly what is at stake. He is not choosing between ambition and family. He is choosing to be a self that includes her, which is a harder, better thing than either giving her up or never leaving her side. Every child is, among other things, a reader of adults, scanning the big people for signs of whether they are safe, whether they are loved, whether they count, and an anxious child reads them constantly and often gets them wrong. Dipper's parents are barely present in the show. They exist, they are mentioned, they sent the twins to Gravity Falls for the summer, but they are almost never on screen, and the caregiving adults in Dipper's actual daily life are his great-uncle Stan and later his great-uncle Ford. Stan is the first father figure the series gives him, and he is a difficult one, gruff and sarcastic and a con man to his bones, a man who shows love mostly by insulting you and would rather lose a tooth than say a tender thing out loud. For a boy desperate to be respected by older men, being placed in the care of Stan is a particular kind of trial, because Stan withholds exactly the thing Dipper most needs, which is open approval. The episode that pries this open is one of the best the series ever made, and it is no accident that it is also one of its most decorated. In this second half of Season 1 episode, Dipper and a couple of others end up inside Stan's mind, walking through his memories. And while they are in there, Dipper stumbles onto a memory in which Stan appears to call him useless. It lands like a blow. Here is the confirmation of the anxious kid's worst private theory, that the gruff adult does not just fail to praise him, but actively holds him in contempt, that all the sarcasm was masking real disdain. Dipper is crushed, and any child who has ever strained for a difficult parent's approval knows the exact flavor of that crush, the way one overheard sentence can seem to explain everything. But it does not leave it there. Dipper sees more of the memory, the fuller version, and learns that the gruff line was not the whole truth at all, that Stan is, underneath the armor, secretly and unmistakably proud of him. The wound and its repair in a single scene. I want to be careful about how I put this because it flattens so easily. The important thing psychologically is not just that Stan loves Dipper, it is what the scene teaches about how a wounded kid reads a gruff caregiver. Dipper's first reading of the memory was not stupid, it was based on real evidence, an actual thing Stan said in an actual moment. But it was partial, and the partial version was catastrophically wrong. That is exactly how an anxious child processes a difficult adult. They catch a fragment, a harsh tone, a dismissive line, a moment of impatience, and they build a whole architecture of rejection on top of it, never seeing the fuller memory in which the same adult is defending them, worrying about them, proud of them, in ways too awkward or too gruff to say directly. The series, in one scene, dramatizes the single most important correction you could offer such a kid, which is that your read of the people who love you badly is probably incomplete, and that the incompleteness is where the pain lives. Stan is not warm, Stan is also not cruel. Stan is a man who cannot say what he feels and feels it anyway, and learning to see the fuller memory, to trust the love that is there even when it is not spoken, is a huge part of Dipper's emotional education. There is a piece of recognition that belongs here because it tells you the makers knew exactly what they had. This episode, the one with the misread memory, is said by many fans to have won a major industry award for the individual achievement of its storyboard artist. And by most accounts, the very next season, another episode, the one where a devastating family secret finally cracks open, won a similar honor again. Stop and notice what that means. Of everything Gravity Falls did, the spectacle, the monsters, the apocalypse, the two moments the industry singled out for its highest honor were both, at their core, about Dipper's deepest wounds, the question of whether the gruff father figure respects him, and the shattering of everything he thought he knew about his family. The show's most decorated moments are not its biggest set pieces, they are its most intimate ones. That is worth holding on to because it tells you what the series actually is under the adventure. It is a show about a kid's heart, and even the people handing out trophies could see that the heart was where the real work was being done. There is a hidden layer in the mind invasion episode that rewards the obsessive viewer, and it feeds directly into what comes next in Dipper's life. The whole thing is orchestrated by Bill Cipher, the triangular dream demon, who guides the kids through Stan's memories, and here, the series plants a clue so subtly that most people miss it for years. At one point, Bill conjures an image of Stan, and sharp-eyed fans have pointed out a detail cropped off by the edge of Bill's own triangular body, what looks like a sixth finger. Long before it reveals that Stan has a secret twin brother with 6 fingers on each hand, the man who wrote the journal, it is teasing you with it, hiding the tell behind Bill's geometry. And in that same episode, Bill's own decoded credits message describes himself as a liar, a monster, and with typical vanity, a snappy dresser. The show is telling you exactly who Bill is, in code, the very first time he really matters, and telling you that a secret 6th-fingered figure is coming, all in an episode that on its surface is about a boy learning his uncle is proud of him. That density, that habit of burying the future inside the emotional present, is part of why this series rewards the exact anxious over-attention that Dipper himself models. Something else about this episode belongs in a psychology study because it is a road not taken, and the road not taken shaped the Dipper we got. By some accounts, an early version of this episode considered a much bigger and darker Bill story. The idea, as fans have pieced it together, was for Bill to invade not just Stan's dreams, but everyone's, all the characters at once, which would have plunged Dipper into a direct confrontation with the show's ultimate villain far earlier than he was ready for. It seems the idea was scaled back so that Bill only entered Stan's mind. Think about what that pullback protected. It kept Dipper's first real brush with the dream demon small, contained, survivable, and it kept the episode's focus on the family wound rather than on cosmic horror. Over and over, when you look at the choices behind the scenes, you find the makers softening Dipper's story, keeping him from the darkest possible version of each episode, protecting the gentleness of the character. He was almost thrown into the deep end with Bill a full season early. Someone decided he should learn about his uncle's love first. That is a kind of authorial tenderness toward a fictional child, and it is everywhere in this show once you start noticing it. What would a psychologist say about a boy whose father figures withhold their warmth, whose parents are absent, and who has to learn to read love in its gruff and incomplete forms? Probably that this is where a lot of Dipper's need for external validation comes from. The craving for respect from anyone older, the way a single approving word from an adult can light him up for a week. When the people who are supposed to affirm you are either absent or armored, you learn to hunt for affirmation, to work for it, to earn it in ways a more securely loved child never has to. That hunger is not a character flaw. It is a reasonable adaptation to a real scarcity. And it sets up perfectly and dangerously the thing that happens when Ford arrives, because Ford is the one adult who does not make Dipper hunt for it. Ford gives it freely, sees him clearly, values exactly the qualities Stan mocks and the world overlooks. To a kid starved for that particular nutrient, Ford is not just a mentor, he is water in the desert, and that is precisely what makes him so dangerous. When Ford finally steps out of the portal and into the second half of the story, he arrives as the answer to a prayer Dipper has been making without words for his whole life. Here is a grown man, brilliant, serious, endlessly curious, who wrote the very journal Dipper has been treating as scripture, and who, crucially, is not embarrassed by the things Dipper is embarrassed about. Ford wants to hear the theories. He respects the note-taking. He treats Dipper not as a kid to be tolerated, but as a fellow mind, a junior colleague, someone whose intelligence is an asset rather than an oddity. For a boy who has spent the summer straining for the approval of a gruff uncle and the whole run of his life feeling slightly too nerdy for every room, Ford is intoxicating. A psychologist would recognize what is happening almost immediately and would probably feel a small flicker of alarm because this is idealization, and idealization of a mentor is one of the most powerful and dangerous forces in a young person's development. Idealizing a mentor is not a mistake, exactly. It is a normal and often necessary stage. A young person reaching for who they might become needs a model, someone a little further down the road, who shows that the road exists and it is natural, healthy even, to look at that person with a kind of awe. The danger is not the admiration itself. The danger is what the admiration blinds you to. When you idealize someone, you tend to stop seeing them clearly. You see the version of them that answers your need, the version that makes you feel chosen and understood, and you edit out the parts that would complicate the picture. And Dipper, gazing up at Ford, is seeing a hero, a genius, an adult who finally gets him, and is not yet able to see the other thing the audience can see, which is that Ford is also a warning. He is a man whose brilliance and whose suspicion and whose refusal to trust cost him everything and everyone he loved. He is what Dipper could become if Dipper's worst tendencies win. The person Dipper most wants to be is the person Dipper should most be afraid of becoming. I touched on that mirror earlier, so I will not lay the whole thing out again, but it deepens here into something a psychologist would find poignant. What Dipper is doing when he idealizes Ford is idealizing a possible future self, and he cannot yet tell whether that future is a promise or a threat. This is the classic double edge of the mentor relationship. The mentor is attractive precisely because they embody a fully grown version of your own traits, and that is why they are dangerous, because your traits, magnified across a whole life, might have gone somewhere terrible. Ford's isolation, his paranoia, his willingness to sacrifice human connection on the altar of the work, these are not foreign to Dipper. They are Dipper's own tendencies, grown to adult size and allowed to run their full course. To look at Ford is to look at where the trust no one road actually ends, and the tragedy is that the road ends somewhere lonely and sad, in a man estranged from his twin for decades, and Dipper is being invited to walk down it while it still looks like an adventure. The invitation becomes literal, and this is the emotional climax of Dipper's entire arc. Ford, recognizing a kindred, brilliant mind, offers Dipper an apprenticeship, a chance to stay in Gravity Falls and study the mysteries of the town, to become his protege, to remain in this place where he is finally understood and valued for exactly who he is. For Dipper, this is not a small offer. It is the fulfillment of everything he has wanted since the first episode. It is respect from an older man on a permanent basis. It is a future where his intelligence is the whole point of him rather than the thing that makes him odd. It is, in the most seductive possible form, the chance to be the special one, the chosen apprentice, the boy who does not have to go back to being an ordinary kid in an ordinary town. And there is only one problem with it, and the problem is Mabel. To take the apprenticeship is to stay while she leaves. It is to choose the mentor over the twin, the future over the person, the idealized version of himself over the sister who has been keeping him human the whole time. A psychologist would call this a developmental fork of the gravest kind, and would be watching closely to see which way he leans because the choice reveals everything. And here the series does something structurally devastating because it does not let the choice stay clean. Dipper and Ford, wrapped up in the intoxication of their bond and the secrecy of their work, keep a dangerous secret from Mabel. There is a rift, a crack in reality that must not fall into the wrong hands, and the men, the brilliant, serious men who trust no one, decide not to tell the goofy sister. And it is that secrecy, that exclusion, born directly of the apprenticeship and the pull between the two like-minded outcasts that sets up the catastrophe. Mabel, overwhelmed and frightened about a future in which her brother leaves her behind, ends up unknowingly handing the rift to Bill. The apocalypse that follows is not something Bill simply inflicts on the town out of nowhere. It grows out of the family's own fractures, out of the secrets the smart, suspicious ones kept, out of the very apprenticeship that was supposed to be Dipper's dream. His idealization of Ford does not just threaten his bond with Mabel, it very nearly ends the world. That is the show making an argument in the largest possible terms that the trust no one, exclude the people who love you path has consequences far beyond the personal. There is a document that makes the Ford relationship almost unbearably moving, and it exists outside the show itself on the page. When the makers published the real, physical journal as a book, they gave it an ending, an epilogue written in Ford's hand. And it is about Dipper. Ford writes about the boy's insecurities directly, and fans who have read it closely say he suggests that Dipper is wiser at 12 than Ford himself was at 30, and that Dipper has an incredible future ahead of him, one in which he will hopefully avoid repeating Ford's terrible errors. Some readers even point to a small human crossout in the text, as though Ford caught himself mid-correction of the boy's age. Read that as a psychologist, and it is extraordinary. Here is the idealized mentor, the man Dipper looked up to with such hunger, delivering a verdict on the anxious kid's deepest fear. The fear that he is not enough and does not deserve respect. And the verdict is that the boy is already wiser than the great genius ever was, that his self-doubt is unfounded, that his future is bright, and that the one thing Ford hopes for him is that he does not become Ford. The mentor, given the last word, uses it not to claim Dipper as a disciple, but to bless him and to warn him. It is the exact opposite of the apprenticeship seduction. It says, in effect, "You do not need to stay and become me. You're already more than I am. Go home." And Dipper does. He turns the apprenticeship down. When the crisis peaks and he has to choose, out loud, he chooses Mabel, chooses to go back to being a kid for a little longer, chooses the ordinary future with his sister over the extraordinary one with his mentor. A psychologist would call that a mature act of individuation, and would note carefully that it is mature precisely because it is not a rejection of Ford or of ambition or of his own gifts. Dipper does not stop loving Ford. He does not stop being brilliant. He does not renounce the mysteries. He simply recognizes at the decisive moment that becoming himself does not require abandoning the person who made him feel safe enough to have a self at all, and that the seductive shortcut to being the special chosen one is not worth the cost of the person he would have to leave to take it. The idealized mentor turns out to be right about the thing that matters most, which is that the boy did not need him. What Dipper needed was already sitting beside him on the bus, in a garish sweater, having saved his life more than once. He just had to be tempted with everything he thought he wanted in order to finally see it. The scariest thing that happens to Dipper across the 2 summers is not being chased by a monster. It is being understood by one. Bill Cipher, the triangular dream demon who drifts in and out of the series, growing steadily more menacing, is a different kind of threat from the gnomes and the ghosts, and a psychologist would find him deeply disturbing, because Bill does not attack Dipper's weaknesses. He attacks his strengths. Bill studies people, learns what they love and what they are driven by, and then offers them a deal that turns exactly those things against them. He is, in the language of harm, a predator who does his homework, and the episode where he gets his hooks into Dipper is one of the darkest and most psychologically precise things it ever did. In the 2nd season episode, Dipper becomes obsessed with cracking into a laptop, a puzzle he believes holds crucial answers, and he cannot let it go. He works at it past the point of reason, past sleep, past sense, driven by his usual conviction that if he just applies enough intelligence and effort, he can solve anything. And Bill, watching, sees the opening, because Bill understands that Dipper's obsessive diligence is a door. He offers to help crack the puzzle in exchange for what sounds like a trivial price, and Dipper, exhausted and tunnel-visioned and desperate to succeed, takes the deal. The price turns out to be his body. Bill possesses him, wears him like a puppet, and the boy who could not stop solving is suddenly a prisoner inside his own skin, watching a demon operate his hands. It is a horror movie premise, and the series plays the horror for real, but the deeper horror is in the mechanism. Dipper did not lose his body because he was greedy or cruel or foolish. He lost it because he was driven and because he could not stop, the very traits that make him good at everything else. Look closer at how Bill baits the trap, because this is the part that elevates the episode from scary to tragic. The deal is not simply about the laptop. Dipper's obsession in that moment is entangled with his love for Mabel, with wanting to help her, to fix things, to be the one who solves the problem for the people he cares about. So when Bill exploits Dipper's diligence, he is also exploiting Dipper's devotion. The manipulation lands because Dipper is good. A greedy kid tempted by a demon is a morality tale. A loving, hard-working kid destroyed by his love, and his hard work is a tragedy, and it is a sharper and truer one, because it says something uncomfortable about how the best people are hurt. Predators do not usually get to the good ones through their vices. They get to them through their virtues, through their loyalty, their diligence, their willingness to sacrifice, their refusal to give up. Bill is the show's darkest teacher, and the lesson he embodies is that being driven and devoted does not make you safe. It can make you a target. There is a delightful piece of production history hiding inside this grim episode, and it lightens the whole thing in a way I find charming. The episode is built around a puppet show, and the puppets in it were not just animated. By some accounts, Hirsch and members of the crew physically puppeteered sock puppets themselves as part of the production, and Hirsch is said to have performed with similar sock puppets on stage at a fan convention afterward. There is something wonderful about knowing that this episode, about a boy losing control of his own body to a puppeteer, was made by grown men with their hands literally inside socks, performing. The metaphor of the whole episode, a person reduced to a puppet, was mirrored in how it was made, and it is a reminder that even at its darkest, this was a show made by people who loved to play, who would get up in front of a crowd of thousands with a sock on their hand, and that the tenderness toward Dipper we keep finding was coming from people who understood, in their own goofy way, exactly how it feels to be manipulated and how it feels to manipulate. A psychologist watching the possession episode would want to say something careful about trauma and about recovery, because the show handles the aftermath in a way that is both realistic and merciful. Dipper does get his body back. Mabel's the one who saves him, which is fitting, given that the whole disaster grew partly out of his drive to help her, and that the sister he keeps trying to protect turns out to be his protector. And it does not pretend the experience leaves no mark, but it also does not overstate the damage. Dipper is not permanently broken by having been possessed. He is shaken, he is warned, he carries it, and he goes on. That balance matters. A great deal of fiction either ignores the aftermath of frightening experiences entirely or wallows in permanent damage, and neither is honest about how real people, and especially real children, tend to move through frightening things. They are affected. They are not necessarily ruined. Dipper survives Bill, learns from it, and remains recognizably himself, which is its own quiet argument for resilience. The books that came later deepen this, and they show a Dipper who has metabolized the encounter with Bill into something like resolve. In one of them, there is reportedly a letter from Dipper to Bill, written in the boy's own voice, in which he lists his accomplishments and vows with real steel to put Bill in the ground if the demon ever threatens his family again. And then, in the most Dipper move imaginable, he immediately second-guesses himself, worrying that the letter came off too arrogant. That is such a precise piece of characterization. Even in the act of standing up to the entity that stole his body, the anxious kid cannot fully trust his own strength, cannot let a defiant statement stand without policing it for how it sounds. The same book reportedly opens with a little test, the kind you fill in to prove you are human, and the phrase it asks Dipper to confirm is, oddly, that he is not Dipper Pines. There is something funny and a little sad in that, the character having to deny himself to pass through the door. But underneath the joke is the thread we have been following the whole time, a boy whose relationship with his own identity is complicated, who is always managing how he is perceived, even by a demon, even in a captcha. What would a psychologist take from Dipper's encounter with Bill, seen whole? Probably that it is the show's most sophisticated statement about how threat works on a person like him. The monsters he can look up. The demon he cannot, because the demon has looked him up first. Bill is what happens when the thing hunting you is smarter than your defenses and knows that your defenses are also your vulnerabilities. And the only real protection against a threat like that is not more vigilance or solving or solo effort, because those are the very traits Bill weaponizes. The only real protection is the thing Dipper spends the whole series learning, which is connection, the sister who pulls him back, the family that refuses to let him be a puppet, the willingness to be saved rather than to save. Bill nearly wins by isolating Dipper inside his own obsession. He loses because Dipper, in the end, is not alone. The demon understood everything about the boy except the one thing that finally beat him, which is that the anxious, driven, self-sacrificing kid had, by then, learned to let himself be held. And you cannot make a puppet of someone who is holding someone else's hand. There is a hole at the center of Dipper's life, and the series is so busy filling it with uncles and mysteries and monsters that you can almost miss it. His parents, they exist, they are mentioned, they pack the twins off to that cabin in Oregon for the summer. And across 2 seasons and 40 episodes, they are essentially never there, never seen, never given a face or a scene or a voice that matters. A psychologist would notice that absence immediately, because absence in a child's life is never neutral. The parents Dipper does not talk about are as psychologically present by their very missingness as the uncles who raise him on screen. And when you start asking what fills the space where a mother and father should be, you understand a great deal about why Dipper is the way he is, why he hunts so hard for the approval of older men, why he clings to his sister, why he is so anxious to be found worthy. For most of the show's run, you could read the absent parents charitably. Plenty of kids get sent to a relative for the summer, and it need not mean anything dark. The twins have each other, they have Stan, they build a whole warm, improvised family in that ramshackle tourist trap. And the series mostly lets the parents stay a pleasant blank, off-screen, and unexamined, so that the found family can take the foreground. But the material that came later, the books the makers published after it ended, went back into that blank and put something into it. And what they put there is one of the clearest keys to Dipper's whole psychology, and one of the saddest. In the book written in Bill's voice, published years after the finale, the makers are said to have revealed what Dipper's worst nightmare actually is. Not monsters, not Bill himself. His worst nightmare is overhearing a fight between his parents that he was never supposed to hear. And Bill, being Bill, twists the knife, suggesting that maybe the reason the twins were hustled out the door and shipped off to their great-uncles for the summer in the first place was so that the parents could have the space to fight, or to consider whether they even wanted to stay together. Now, a careful person has to be honest about what this is. It is Bill talking, and Bill is a liar and a manipulator whose whole method is to find the tenderest thing in you and press on it. So this is not the show declaring as flat fact that Dipper's parents are divorcing, but it is the makers deciding deliberately that this is the wound to reach for, that of all the fears they could have named as the deepest one in this particular boy, the one they chose was a child pressed against a door, hearing the 2 people who are supposed to be his foundation come apart. For a psychology study of a kid whose parents are so conspicuously absent all series long, that is the missing keystone, and it recontextualizes everything. Because think about what it would mean if that fear is even partly real. A boy who overheard his parents fighting, who half suspects he and his sister were removed from the house so the adults could deal with something too big and too frightening to have children around for, would carry exactly the constellation of traits Dipper carries. The hypervigilance makes sense because he learned to listen at doors, to scan the adults for signs of trouble, to read tension in a room before anyone said a word. The need to be good, to be worthy, to earn respect makes sense because children who sense their family fracturing very often conclude, wrongly but powerfully, that if they were only better, smarter, less trouble, they could hold it together. The desperate wish to grow up fast makes sense because a kid who has glimpsed the instability of the adult world often decides that safety lies in becoming an adult himself, in being competent and in control, rather than in staying a helpless child at the mercy of grown-ups who might come apart at any moment. And the fierce, almost frightened attachment to Mabel makes the deepest sense of all, because when the big structures feel unreliable, the sibling beside you becomes the one stable thing, the person who was there before, who will be there after, the family you can actually count on. Suddenly, the whole character organizes itself around that whole. The series, even without the books, kept measuring Dipper's family situation against others, as if inviting you to notice both the wound and the luck. There is an episode built around a birthday that turns out not to be the twins at all, but Seuss's, the shack's lovable handyman, and the episode reveals that Seuss hates his own birthday because it is bound up with his father's abandonment, a dad who promised to come and never did. Set that beside Dipper, and the contrast does gentle work. Whatever is going on with Dipper's absent parents, and it may be something painful, he has a warm and unbreakable bond with his twin, an uncle who loves him gruffly, a found family in that shack. Seuss measures Dipper's relative fortune. Neither boy has the simple, intact family the culture pretends is standard, and it keeps showing you kids who are improvising love out of whatever pieces they were handed, which is, if you look honestly, how a great many children actually grow up. The most revealing thing about Dipper's own family wound is how it shapes the way he treats other wounded kids. And here the series gives him a mirror in the form of Pacifica, the wealthy, anxious daughter of the town's richest family. In the episode where Dipper is pulled into her world, the psychology is all about class and parental control. Pacifica is a rich girl on a very short leash, controlled and shaped and pressured by cold, image-obsessed parents, and Dipper, a working-class coded kid with no such wealth and no such visible parents at all, becomes the person who helps her defy them, who tells her she does not have to be what her family is making her. It is a striking thing to watch because Dipper, whose own parents are a painful blank, is unusually good at being a moral anchor for a kid whose parents are a suffocating presence. Two opposite family failures, the absent and the controlling, and Dipper somehow knows exactly what to say to the other side of it. That episode, incidentally, is often singled out by fans as one of the show's most acclaimed outings, another case of it being recognized precisely for its quietest, most character-driven work rather than its spectacle. The books are said to extend that thread too, giving Dipper a story where he is teamed reluctantly with Pacifica again, this time against a monster that steals faces. And the emotional heart of it is Dipper telling the insecure heiress that she is more than just a pretty face. Sit with the irony and the beauty of that. Dipper, a boy so ashamed of his own face that he hides a birthmark under his hair. A boy so anxious about how he is perceived that he polices his own defiant letters for arrogance, is the one who tells another anxious child that her worth is not in how she looks or in what her family demands she be. He gives her the exact reassurance he cannot quite give himself. That is one of the most human things a person can do, to offer someone else the kindness you are still learning to offer yourself. And it tells you that underneath all the anxiety, Dipper has a good instinct about people, a tenderness that his own fears keep him from turning inward. So what would a psychologist say about the hole at the center of Dipper's life? Probably that it explains the shape of him more completely than any monster does, and that the series, and especially the books, were brave to eventually name it rather than leaving it a comfortable blank. A child with absent parents and a half-heard fight in his memory does not necessarily become a broken adult. What he becomes depends on what fills the hole, and Dipper is, in the end, lucky because the hole gets filled with real things, a sister who never leaves, uncles who learn to say they are proud, a whole strange town of people who care. The nightmare is real, and so is the rescue. And the deepest argument the show ever makes about him is that a kid who started with a fracture at the foundation can still, with enough love poured into the gap, grow up whole. Not unmarked, whole. We should end where the boy's own name begins, because his name is the tidiest possible summary of everything we have been circling. He is not really called Dipper, his name is Mason. The makers confirmed it, and it was made canon in the published books, so it is not a fan guess or a loose thread. Mason Pines, and Dipper is a nickname earned from a birthmark on his forehead, a cluster of spots shaped like the Big Dipper, the constellation, the asterism that points the way to the North Star. He hides it. He tucks it under his hair and under his hat. And for most of the series, you never see it because he is ashamed of it, because it marks him, because it is a visible sign of being different that he would rather the world did not read. Think about the shape of that. A boy whose true name is written on his own body in stars and who spends his life covering it up. You could not invent a cleaner image for the self-consciousness we have been studying this whole time. His identity is literally a constellation he keeps hidden. The birthmark only becomes visible on screen a handful of times across the whole run, usually in a moment of crisis when the hat comes off and there is no time to hide. And each time it flashes into view, it carries a small charge, because you are seeing the part of himself he most wants concealed. A psychologist would find that almost too perfect. The thing that gives him his name, his identity, the marker of who he really is the thing he treats as a secret shame, exposed only when he is too frightened or too overwhelmed to keep his guard up. That is how shame works in a person. The truest things about us are so often the things we are most desperate to keep covered, and they tend to slip out precisely in the moments we have lost control, when the careful management fails and the real self shows through. And here's where the makers did something I find wonderful, a choice that tells you exactly what kind of storytellers they are. Hirsch has been asked more than once what the birthmark means, whether there is a deeper significance, a secret explanation, a hidden key. and he refuses to answer, not because he has not decided, but on principle. He has said more or less that he likes to leave a few things unexplained, that some answers are satisfying, but sometimes an answer is less satisfying than being able to wonder about it yourself, and that if he has not explained something by now, it is because he is keeping it. So the mark that gives Dipper his name is a mystery the creator is deliberately, permanently withholding, not from carelessness, but as a gift, the gift of a question that stays open. There is something fitting about that beyond the obvious. This is a show and a character built entirely around the compulsion to decode everything, to solve every puzzle, to leave nothing uncatalogued. And at the very center of its hero, on his own face, is the one thing that will never be solved, the one cipher with no answer key, placed there on purpose by a man who understood that a life with no unsolved mysteries in it would be a poorer life. Dipper the Decoder carries, forever, an undecodable mark. I think that is the show telling him, and us, that not everything is supposed to be figured out. The other object on his head has an origin just as revealing, and it is one of my favorite facts in the whole series, because it gently demolishes the idea of destiny. The blue and white cap with the little pine tree on it, the hat Dipper wears through the entire show, the hat that becomes his emblem, was not his to begin with, and he did not choose it for any meaningful reason. His original lucky hat, the one he had worn since he was small, was a completely different cap, brown and green with a star on it. In the series premiere, during a chaotic chase, a gnome yanks that original hat off his head and it is lost. And at the end of that same episode, Dipper simply grabs the blue pine tree cap off a rack in Stan's gift shop, a free souvenir, a piece of tourist trap merchandise, a consolation prize from a grab bag. That is how he acquires the pine tree, not by fate, by losing something in a scramble and picking up whatever was nearest. Why does that matter so much? Because that pine tree becomes, by the end of the series, his symbol in the show's central prophecy. There is a zodiac, a wheel of symbols, each one belonging to a hero, and Dipper's symbol is the pine tree, the very thing on his souvenir hat. Bill even nicknames him Pine Tree, as if it were essential to him, written into the cosmic order. And it is essential by the end. But it started as a gift shop accident. The series is making a subtle, and I think deeply, reassuring argument about identity, one worth underlining for every anxious kid who thinks they are supposed to have it all figured out. You do not arrive with your symbol. You are not born knowing who you are. Sometimes the thing that becomes most essentially you starts as an accident, a hat you grabbed because you lost the other one, a role you fell into, a nickname that stuck. And it becomes destiny not because it was destiny all along, but because you wore it, lived it, made it yours over time. Dipper's emblem was random. It became meaningful because of everything he did while wearing it. That is how most real identities are actually built, out of accidents we grow into. And the writers knew it and put it right there in the first episode for anyone patient enough to look. Even the way the character was drawn tells this story of a self that developed rather than arrived. In the unaired pilot, made before it was really the show, Dipper looked different in a small but telling way. By most accounts, he had a brighter, more generic look at first, the cheerful marker of a typical happy cartoon kid. The tired shadows under his eyes, the faint bags that became one of his most recognizable features, the visual shorthand for a boy who is anxious and does not sleep enough and carries too much, those seem to have come later, as if by a deliberate design choice. So even his face evolved toward the anxiety. The makers looked at a bright-cheeked, untroubled little cartoon boy and decided, no, this one should look tired, should wear his worry where you can see it. The Dipper we know, the one with the shadows under his eyes, was a choice to make the character's inner state visible on his face, the same way the cracking voice made it audible. Everything about him was tuned, over time, toward showing you a kid who is carrying something, and then, at the very end, the show lets him put some of it down. In the finale, the twins turn 13, and their summer is over, and it is time to leave Gravity Falls and go home to California, back to their ordinary lives, back to being kids in a suburb. Dipper has, by then, made his choice. He has turned down the apprenticeship, chosen his sister, let go of the crush. The friends gather to say goodbye, and there is a message, as fans remember it, that says simply, "See you next summer." And Dipper gets on the bus, having chosen the ordinary future over the extraordinary one, having chosen to keep being a kid for a while longer rather than take the seductive shortcut to being the special grown-up genius he thought he wanted to be. A psychologist would call that the healthiest possible resolution of everything we have watched. He does not stop being ambitious or smart or curious. He simply stops being in such a hurry. He accepts at last that he is 13, that he has time, that childhood is not a failure state to be escaped, but a place he is allowed to be, and that the people who love him would rather have him slow and present than fast and gone. That is what a healthy summer looks like for a kid like Dipper, and it is worth naming plainly because it is tempting to want a more dramatic ending. He does not defeat his anxiety. Anxiety is not a monster you kill. He does not become fearless or carefree or suddenly at ease in his own skin. What he does is smaller and more real. He loosens his grip. He trusts his sister a little more and himself a little less rigidly. He learns that some things are shared, not solved, that the shield can come down, that being a kid is allowed. He gets on the bus, still anxious, still a decoder, still carrying the birthmark under his hat, still Mason pretending to be nothing but Dipper. But he gets on the bus having chosen connection over control, having been tempted with everything he thought he wanted and turned it down for the person beside him. He is not fixed, he is growing. And for an anxious, over-serious, self-doubting kid who spent a whole summer terrified of being small, that is not a small thing. That is the whole thing. It is strange when you step back how much a children's cartoon about a haunted Oregon town turned out to be a careful, honest portrait of one anxious boy, and how much of that portrait was a grown man drawing himself. Gravity Falls has kept its hold on people for years now, long past the summer it went off the air, and I do not think it is the monsters or the ciphers or even the apocalypse that keeps it alive. Though those are all wonderful, I think it is that a lot of people watched Dipper and saw themselves, saw the kid who took everything too seriously, who wanted so badly to be respected, who turned fear into research because feeling it directly was too much, who envied a sibling's ease, who hid the truest thing about himself under a hat. The show became a place where that kid was not mocked but understood, and it turns out there are a great many of us who needed to be understood that way, and who found it, of all places, on a Disney Channel between advertisements. What a psychologist would finally say about Dipper. Pines is probably not a diagnosis because he does not need one, and the show was always careful never to hand him one. What they would say is something closer to a blessing, the kind Ford wrote in the back of that journal, that the anxiety made sense, that the vigilance was a reasonable answer to a deeply uncertain world and a home with a hole in it, that the drive to grow up fast was the silliest and the easiest to forgive, and that the boy was going to be all right, not because he conquered any of it, but because he was loved enough by a sister and a pair of difficult uncles and a whole strange town to slowly learn that he did not have to carry it alone. That is the quiet argument underneath all the weirdness. You do not have to solve yourself. You just have to let the right people close enough to help you hold it. So if you have been drifting off somewhere in the last couple of hours, I hope it was a gentle drift, and I hope Dipper kept you good company on the way down. He is easy company once you understand him, a worried, tender, brave little kid doing his best in a world too big for him, which is, in the end, all any of us ever were. Rest well. Let the worry set itself down for the night, the way he finally learned to. If you enjoyed the video, make sure to subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.